Okay, we'll make a start. Well, welcome everybody and thank you for joining us today for the Farm300 webinar. I'm Jane Witherley and I'm with Meat and Livestock Australia, and today we're looking to provide you with an overview of the program, to give you a real taste of some of the activities that have been going on as part of the program, and to also give you an update on some of the opportunities that are emerging out of the ERF program. So firstly, just some housekeeping to start with. Make sure that you've muted your audio. Please don't start your video when joining the WebEx. We will be having a Q&A session at the end, so please make sure that if you want to ask questions that you put them into the chat box, and we'll make sure that we address them through the Q&A session towards the end. And also just to note that the webinar will be recorded and be made available on the MLA website. So today, everyone may have seen the agenda. I'll give a quick overview of what the program's all about, and then hand over to Basil Doonan, who's our National Coordinator, to conduct an interview with John Francis, one of our coaches, and also one of our producer participants, James Pearce. We'll also get Phil Conn from Ramp Carbon to give us the overview of ERF opportunities that are emerging with a case study, and then we'll go through the Q&A session towards the end of the webinar. So I'll just kick off now with an overview of what the program's all about. So Farm300 is a program that's funded through the federal government's Extension and Outreach program, and the idea of the program is to provide producers with an opportunity to improve their knowledge and skills, leading to a 10% increase in on-farm productivity and profitability, as well as a 30% decrease in their greenhouse gas emissions. This program is led by Meat and Livestock Australia as a co-investor with the federal government, but we also have a number of partners who are involved in the program, including the Australian Farm Institute, Australian Wool Innovation and Dairy Australia. We also have a steering committee who's helped direct the program and the key activities that we deliver, and that includes world-renowned researchers of Richard Eckhart and Beverly Henry. We also have representatives from our partners, Kathy Phelps from Dairy Australia, Adam Tomlinson from Australian Farm Institute, Taryn Blythe from AWI, or Australian Wool Innovation, Tom Davison and myself from Meat and Livestock Australia. So Farm300 is a program that's been operating for over 12 months now and achieved quite a considerable amount in this period of time. Overall, we've upskilled 128 livestock industry advisors in some of the greenhouse gas technologies and also the emissions reduction fund. We've provided support to 23 advisors overall to deliver coaching programs to 330 livestock producers to increase their profit and decrease their greenhouse gas emissions. And we've also developed quite a body of support material to underpin all that activity. We've delivered a number of workshops and also the coaching groups spread right across the country, from as far north as Rockhampton, right down to Tasmania, and as far west as Albany in WA. The key activities, so I guess the main activity that we've delivered through Farm300 is the coaching program. Farm300, the name is all about trying to at least engage 300 producers in the process of coaching. The coaching methodology was selected based on it being one of the most effective best practice methods to actually support practice change with producers, providing them with the key principles around what we're seeking to improve in their business, and then providing them with a supported learning process over a period of time to help implement and adapt that within their business. So the coaching program in each of the locations was designed by the advisor themselves to make sure it was locally relevant for their situation. It's been delivered over 4 to 6 months in groups of 80 to 20 producers. It's included one-on-one components where the participants in each of the groups have an opportunity to work directly with their coach. A range of topics and opportunities to learn new skills in discussions with other producers and the coach have been set up as part of the process. We've also made sure that we're utilising the latest on-farm tools that are available to help in the analysis of individual farm businesses as we go along. So they've included the farm gas calculator, the SGAF and BGAF models as well, which helps to measure the actual emissions on farm and then look at opportunities for reducing those through various management practices. In terms of what producers can do now to reduce their emissions from livestock, a lot of it is just about implementing best practice of existing practices they already have in their businesses. So looking at reducing unproductive animal numbers, shifting herd or flock numbers to the business end. And by that we mean look at producing more meat per cow or per ewe, increasing the fertility or changing to early joining, to increase higher weaning percentages, trying to look at ways to increase the efficiency and enable early finishing of beef. So systems efficiency, again, opportunities are really about improving the feed conversion efficiency of animals, looking at improving the ratio of feed that's going into meat as opposed to just maintenance of animals, and improving the pastures and forage legumes that are within the composition of pastures. Now, in terms of resources, I mentioned before that quite a body of resources have been developed to underpin the coaching process, but also outside of that, there's a number of resources available that anyone can tap into. Most of them are located on the MLA website under the Farm300 page. So there's an online climate hub there with a lot of information available around those key practices that we mentioned. We've got a lot of online case studies, so real-life examples of producers who are implementing a lot of the practices and improvements that have been nominated as part of the coaching process. And also publications such as the Sustainable Grazing Manual has also been included and updated. We've also done a number of webinars that have been recorded, so people are more than welcome to go back and have a look at some of those that have been delivered over the duration of the program. So I guess just to finish up, the bottom line around this program is all about good business management leads to good carbon management. So I'll now hand over to our National Coordinator, Basil Doonan, and he'll take us through the interview with our coach and our producer representative. Thank you, Basil.
Thanks, Jane. Yeah, as Jane said, we were fortunate to be the National Coordinator for the Farm300 project, and as part of that, we've been privileged to work directly with 23 coaches and over 330 producers. Today we've got two of those here with us. So we have John Francis from Holmes and Sackett. Many of you will know John, but he's got over 20 years experience in the advisory field and he's based out of Wagga Wagga. And we've also got James Pearce, who's in one of John's groups, and he's a Farm300 participant from Yavin, Herefords, near Adelong in New South Wales. So I'd like to thank you both for coming today. And I'd like to start with you, John, just in terms of why you became involved in the Farm300 project.
Yeah, look, there was a lot of opportunity and a lot of the messages that we were looking to deliver were consistent with what we deliver in any case. A lot of them are consistent with what the findings were out of the Southern Beef situation analysis. We're looking for productivity gains which were consistent with reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So it was very easy to be involved because I saw the connection and felt that we had something to offer. We also had a group of willing participants, so the process was pretty seamless as far as I was concerned.
Okay. Can you tell me a little bit about your thoughts on the coaching program as a method for lifting practice change and skill development?
Yeah, look, I guess what I found really useful about the program was that we met consistently month on month. So there was a bit of a time frame there that we needed to deliver by, which I actually found a real benefit. I saw that following up month on month meant that we went back through what we'd done the previous session. We reinforced the skills that were developed in the previous session. We ran through the issues. It gave us enough time to consider what the issues were, and people were thinking about the next session before we got there. So it provided us with opportunity to explore ideas for the next session as well. But in terms of, and look, it's been, the evaluation data actually supported the fact that it was successful because we've measured change on farm, so it's been fantastic.
So you talked a little bit about your project there, but can you just give us a bit of an overview of some of the things that you were looked at and addressed?
Yeah, sure. One of the things we found with benchmarking is that the most profitable and most productive have higher feed utilisation. That higher feed utilisation is a result of better feed efficiency, better feed utilisation, and it results in more kilos of beef per hectare turned off. So what we were looking to do was, I guess, reduce time of turn off from our producers. We were looking to build an understanding of the feed base and how the feed base actually, how feed supply looks, and looking to demonstrate the importance of matching your system to that feed availability. Some of the other things that I guess were reinforced were the importance of improving soil fertility to build on pasture availability, and that improved utilisation doesn't come without improved skill as well. So I think those were probably the key things that we were looking to do. A lot of it was skills-based, so we were looking at pastures and we were improving the assessment skills of our participants at assessing pastures. We were trying to provide them with an understanding of what the likely growth rates were of pastures, as well as what the animal intake was, depending on what stage of the reproductive cycle those animals were at.
So then, just in terms of some of the opportunities that producers might have, like right now, in terms of lifting productivity and decreasing greenhouse gas emissions,
yep.
Can you just outline some of those?
Yeah, well, what we learnt, I guess, when we were trying to, or when we were being coached ourselves into the ERF and the processes that were going on to support our delivery mechanisms, were that genetics was a pretty important component. There was various research going on into the feed base, which is quite exciting. Unfortunately, I think we've got a bit of time to go before we can get there, but it was exciting to talk about what's in the pipeline. And the other part was some of the biological stuff with gut mechanisms and so on in terms of reducing emissions with some of the other stuff. Now, we touched on that, but it wasn't really the part of our program, and you probably know better than I do about all the other ones, but they were just some of what I thought were pretty exciting.
So do you think that the group or the producers in the group, maybe it's a question for James, are better positioned now to capitalise on those pieces of research that are in the pipeline?
Yeah, look, I think we didn't focus primarily on the bits of research that were in the pipeline now, but certainly they understand that that science is there, and when that science is getting closer to the business end, I think, I don't know, you're better off asking James about whether he's going to pursue those sorts of things.
Yeah, it's a fair point. Like, I suppose initially for us, we've taken one step along the stepping stone, and now to know that those other the research work is in the pipeline, we're now more aware. If we can get our own on-farm stuff sorted out, then we can start looking into what will come later on and how we can apply it. But initially, like John said, we've just worked on what we can do at the moment, and just to know that these things are happening is very important. And then, yeah, hopefully we're set up where we can take advantage of those sort of things as they come more readily available to producers effectively.
So, John, one of the things about participating in the problem was that baseline data around both emissions and productivity, profitability. Can you tell us about where the group started and maybe how far along that process you think they've come?
Yeah, so what we did was we took our benchmarking information and we looked at an average producer system, and we looked at what the emissions were from that average producer, and then we modelled a system using our benchmarking data to look at how far you would progress if you went down the path of being a top 20% producer. And there were some pretty significant gains there. So I guess the key point that we were trying to demonstrate in that process was that there is opportunity both to improve profitability, productivity, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so it was an easy message to deliver. In terms of how far down that path we are, look, I think this helps us get down that path. The evaluation shows that there has been practice change, and that's really encouraging. But I think we've got more to do, so I'd love to see the next project which gets us further down the chain, I guess.
Mm-hmm. That's a valid point. I mean, you can't implement massive change overnight, and everyone in our group are at different levels, and we've got to work out what we can do and get our skill set better, which we did through the course of the program. But as we need to really follow it on to make more gains, and then take a step back and say, well, this is where you were and this is where you are now. And I think, our program really only went for the best part of 6 months. So, yeah, to make massive change, or not necessarily need to be massive change, but to really see the benefits of that, I think you're going to have to look at things further down the track.
Mm-hmm. And then, as a coach, John, you mentioned that there were some things that, became obvious for you throughout the process, quite specific.
Yeah, so I guess our project was very specific. It was about improving skills in pasture assessment, was one of the aspects, and I guess I was learning as well. And one of the things I guess that we all learnt pretty well was that visual assessment is great at certain times of the year, but then it's not so great at other times of the year. And if you think about it, it makes sense, but it's important to understand that, because conceptually we were looking at a massive pasture in winter, which was at 90% moisture or 10% dry matter. We were looking at the same massive pasture in summer, which was at 90% dry matter or 10% moisture. And whilst they look the same, they're very different in terms of the actual amount that's available there. And so those conceptual ideas were challenging for me. And so what we came to the conclusion was that cutting is absolutely critical. But one of the issues there is that you can't do enough cuts necessarily across a paddock. So new technologies, I think, would be critical, in my view, to improving that. And we've gone some way down the path. We're using some of that reversing camera technology to establish how much biomass is there. And we think that's really exciting progression for us. So, yeah, that was a really good finding for me. And I think the group also sort of felt the same way, because at times we were being challenged by what we were seeing there, and we were doing the cuts and we were wildly out from our visual assessments. The cuts helped us get a better gauge. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, from where I started to where we finished I've come quite a long way down that path, but to have a better handle on where basically you just can't drive into a paddock and say, oh, there's X, Y, Z there, and be confident that it's there. And under this, after this program, we've got the skills to do it better and really analyse it to a far greater degree.
And I guess that was one of the fundamental issues with the project, is that we were dealing with sort of complex farming systems. We wanted skill development, so there had to be that opportunity for repetition, opportunity to practice. A question that's just come from one of our online participants is, can you tell us what the difference between coaching and consulting was, and how you found the difference?
Look, I guess for me, consulting is a reasonably dogmatic approach. Where I am trying to establish the opportunities, but probably in a reasonably forthright way, presenting the data and giving my opinion. What I'm trying to do in coaching is present the information, allow participants to make their own mind up based on the information, but through reinforcement of the ideas, through the peer support network, and through questioning of me, hopefully there's an opportunity to improve in your own time.
Mm-hmm. So on one hand, when I'm consulting, pay me, I'll tell you the answer. On the other side, when I'm coaching, I'll help you learn the skills and you can solve the problems for yourself.
Yeah, I think that's right. And but I think it depends on what your consultancy style is too. I try and use a bit of coaching in my own consultancy style. I don't like to dictate the terms of learning. I think being challenged is really important in any exchange of information, and I think that's absolutely critical, in fact, and most people learn when they're challenged and can do it in their own time.
And I think our group was good for that too. Like, there was a lot of questioning, and the discussion we had was one of the most valuable things we got, or I personally got out of it, because we are learning from each other as well as from John, and to get that networking base was really a gold mine for us, and strengthening that as we went along.
So was that the main reason you became involved, James, or why did you become involved specifically in the project?
Oh, that was definitely one. We're very fortunate in our area to have a group of farmers that are pretty much a similar age to myself. We're running the operation of our enterprises, and to be able to bounce off ideas, because we're all currently dealing with roughly the same season, so to be able to do that and how we're taking it on and what class of stock we're running where and why is all important. So that was definitely one reason. I really enjoyed the networking we've got out of that. But the other one for me was I knew that my pasture budgeting skill set was limited. I basically would drive into a paddock and say there's enough food there at the moment to run the cattle for now, and I wouldn't do it on a regular basis, or I'd do it on a need-to-know type thing when you started getting challenged, rather than necessarily running things harder or better or something like that. And while it worked, it shows to a degree there was definitely opportunity to run things better. And by doing this course, I'm now better able to handle, visually assess, but also analyse our pasture base more accurately and make decisions as a result.
So have you done much professional development in the past?
No, I haven't. I enjoy that side of things, but no, I haven't done a lot, and this was an opportunity to obviously do that. And I mean, I'm exposed to different, in our seed stock business, we go to different conferences and genetic type based things, but this is obviously more of a production one, so it was good to tie things back in that way.
And how did you find the coaching process?
Oh, it was very interactive, which is what I really enjoyed about it. As I said earlier, we got the opportunity to discuss a lot of things. Like, we were given figures, and we were given the use of different websites and the data from that to make decisions as part of the overall result that we were after. But I liked the fact that, like, John had prepared what we needed to go through. It was clear where, when we started that session, roughly finished. And yeah, I thought it was really good that way to work through the problem. We went to each individual, we went to different farmers' properties throughout the course of the program, and so we got to see different enterprises. Sometimes there's only a paddock or two of that particular operation, but it was still an insight to what they were doing, and each producer explained what they were trying to do, how they were doing it, and then we'd kick around figures and talk about it and come up with ideas of why that may work, or why are you doing it, and then you found that you had to justify it to an extent what you were doing. And it's good to be challenged that way, because you don't, when you're on your farm doing what you've always done, sometimes it's good to have somebody else look at what you're doing and ask you simply why, and you might not consider why until you're confronted with that.
So John was mentioning earlier about that coaching process where you review what you did last time, you get an opportunity to practice, you basically keep going over each session beforehand and then adding a bit more to it. Did you find that monotonous or boring, or really useful, or?
Oh no, it was definitely not boring. It was very useful because the last 6 months, the 6 months that we did the program weren't what I describe as usual seasons. So we had to talk about the changes that we'd experienced, which for example, we got a lot more summer rain than we normally do in our area. So we got more green food as a result. We got more degradation of the dry food that we had. So therefore, we talk about those changes and review where we were and where we'd gone to, and how do we take it on, and have we got enough green food that we could go and do some opportunity training and stuff like that. So there was a whole different aspect to that.
So in terms of the skills that you've now acquired, how do you feel around dealing with some of those things that Jane talked about earlier that result in increased greenhouse gas outcomes around getting rid of animals earlier, taking unproductive animals out of the system, decreasing the amount of feed going to maintenance, better aligning your production system with animal requirements?
Yeah, well, we're currently pretty well a split calving system. We're about roughly around 700 females we calve annually, and I've seen through this program, I suppose, the hard evidence of why a spring calving system would work better in our area. So that means that, and part of that is knowing better matching feed utilisation to feed production. From a seed stock point of view, we've always been aware of culling out inferior animals, so that was basically a given for me. Turn-off time's critical irrespective of your operation, I think, and again, the genetic component of that ties in with what we do. But having productive pastures that really do what you want to do. But also, for me, it was more about utilising feed better too. Like, while we had a bit of extra summer rain, we've also had a dry period since, and I got to the point where I was running more cattle in paddocks for longer than I otherwise would have, because I had greater confidence levels of the pasture base that was there as a result of doing this. So I wasn't overstocking, but I was better utilising what I had, and I had a great confidence that I was going to be able to do that for longer than otherwise. So it's just basically knowing where you're at and how much longer you can be at that level.
So then just a final question to you both, I guess, to wrap up. Through the project, have you got a better feel for the relationship between good environmental outcomes in this space and productivity, and that they can go hand in hand? There's not the same level of conflict perhaps we might have thought?
I think that's a massive, extremely important question, because there is this sometimes theory that once you increase stocking rate, you are therefore running things too hard or potentially causing environmental damage, and it doesn't have to be that way. It shouldn't be that way, and doing this course shows that it doesn't have to be, because you know what you've got and you know how far you need to push it. You can still have 100% ground cover if that's one of your targets or your wants. But I think, yeah, it all intertwines. It's just getting a better skill base and knowledge of how to do that, really. So.
Yeah, and look, I think my view is that those two are not, that we can have lower emissions and greater productivity, and in fact I think that's a really positive for producers, because those things that lead to greater profitability and greater productivity also lead to lower emissions. So I think it's a really good news story as far as I'm concerned, and it was very easy to be involved as a result of that story being so easy.
Well, thanks very much to you both for coming along today and going through the process. I'd ask people to clap, but you can't hear them anyway. So,
I'm sure they are out there, Basil. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. So if I could just remind people to turn their cameras off, or you're going to come up on the screen here. And also, if you want to post questions, if you can just click on the chat box and send your questions in, that'd be great. So the next session is with Phil Conn. I'd like to welcome Phil along. He's had quite a lot of input into the Farm300 project. He's been responsible for a significant increase in producer, our coaches' understanding of the CFI and now the ERF, and we really appreciate his input into the program. Phil's going to provide an overview of the Emissions Reduction Fund, so hopefully we've got you there, Phil, and I'll hand over to you now.
Thanks, Basil. Yep, I'm here. Can you guys hear me okay at your end?
Yep.
Okay, terrific. I'll get started. So, thanks for the introduction. I guess what I wanted to do in today's webinar was just provide a very, very brief bit of context for people in relation to sort of state of play with global carbon markets, and then get into a little bit of detail for people, which will hopefully be a refresher, given that we're at the end of the Farm300 program. Just a bit of a refresher on where we've got to with the Emissions Reduction Fund. How is it different from the Carbon Farming Initiative, and how producers might go about getting involved. And then I wanted to do two things. One was provide people with a bit of a heads up of a new methodology that's coming through under the ERF, which might be of interest to beef producers out there. And then finally just finish up with a bit of a case study using some data from a couple of the coaches who have participated in the Farm300 program, just to sort of show some of the potential there from getting involved in the ERF. So if we just go to the next slide. This slide is one that I like to wheel out. It's from a report that's produced every year by the World Bank that covers off on all the carbon trading schemes and emissions trading schemes that are active around the world. And basically what you can see there is any country that's got or state or province that's coloured in either has an active emissions trading scheme or is planning to implement an emissions trading scheme or a carbon tax. And look, based on this data, we know that there's now nearly 40 countries plus a further 20-odd sub-national jurisdictions, that is states or provinces, that have a price on carbon. That is, emitters have to pay for their pollution. And I think, that's significant, progress on in terms of new environmental regulations that are coming out there, and we're now pricing about a quarter of global emissions, which is pretty good given, potentially the amount of negative sentiment that's been out there around carbon trading schemes, particularly in Australia, as we all know. I think one thing that's really important to highlight there is in China. For the last couple of years, China's been running some pilot emissions trading schemes in 6 or 7 provinces and cities, and they're now going to scale that up next year, launching in 2016 to a national emissions trading scheme. So we've got China, largest emitter in the world, which from next year will force its heavy industrial emitters to pay for their pollution. So some really, I think, clear forward momentum around pricing carbon emissions globally. If we go to the next slide, I guess we can turn our attention to the domestic front, and that is the policy environment in which we're all operating, which is the Emissions Reduction Fund. So just like the Carbon Farming Initiative, the ERF aims to provide an incentive. So it's a voluntary opt-in scheme that you can choose to participate in. It's trying to provide you with an incentive to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions. So under the ERF, just as it was under the CFI, if you reduce 1 tonne of greenhouse gas emissions or sequester a tonne of carbon in vegetation, you can get issued with an Australian Carbon Credit Unit. That's an ACCU. To participate in the ERF, there's 4 steps that the government's put forward as the pathway to participation. Step 1 is obviously apply. So that is, you need to know what your project activity is, how you want to achieve your emission reduction, and you need to apply an approved methodology that will be essentially the recipe that you need to follow in order to be eligible and quantify the emission reductions that you're creating. Step 2 in the process is kind of you don't have to do step 2, but most participants will, and that is you can participate in an auction. That is, you can seek to get the government to purchase your emission reductions. And this is a key difference between the ERF and the Carbon Farming Initiative. Under the previous government's program, the CFI, the buyers of your carbon credits would have been large industrial and corporate emitters who had a liability to pay for their emissions, and they could offset some of those emissions by buying carbon credits that were produced under the CFI. Under the ERF, it's a little bit different. Producers will in fact sell their carbon credits to the government, and they do that through these reverse auctions. And we'll go into a little bit more detail of how you might participate in those auctions next. Step 3 is reporting and auditing. So basically, once you've implemented your project, you need to monitor your activities and what you're doing, collect some data, in order to demonstrate to an independent auditor that you actually have reduced emissions. And once the auditor signs off on your activities, and you can demonstrate that you have reduced emissions, you're able to claim those carbon credits, and that's when you go to step 4. Those carbon credits, you can then transfer them to the government, assuming you've been successful under step 2 at the auction, and you'll get paid for those emission reductions. So that's, I guess, the 2-minute overview of how the Emissions Reduction Fund works. I would please, if you are interested in learning more, the Clean Energy Regulator website has got a huge amount of information there for participants or potential participants. So please, just this presentation will give you a very high-level overview. The detailed information on how you would participate is all available publicly on the Clean Energy Regulator website. If we go to the next slide, I guess the key changes that we've seen under the Emissions Reduction Fund compared to the CFI, I've already mentioned one, which is who'll be buying your carbon credits. So we've changed from, I guess, corporate or industrial emitters to the government purchasing carbon credits. But everything else that's been achieved to date under the CFI, that is the methodologies that have been approved, the projects that have been registered, all of those activities are being recognised, so nothing's being left behind, and it's all being folded into the Emissions Reduction Fund program. But what it has done is also extend the coverage, so that whilst previously under the CFI you really had projects that could reduce emissions in the land sector being recognised, land and waste sectors being recognised. Under the Emissions Reduction Fund, you can create projects across the economy in any sector. If you can demonstrate that you've reduced emissions, then you can create a carbon credit and sell it back to the government. One final piece which doesn't often get a lot of airtime that is I think a pretty significant change under the Emissions Reduction Fund is that within the methodologies, that is those recipes that tell you how to calculate your emission reductions, there is allowance for improvements in emissions intensity. So you may not be able to reduce your total emissions, and I think this is particularly important for the agricultural sector, where what we can do is under the ERF now is recognise an improvement in emissions intensity. So that aligns really well with what we've been trying to, I guess, do under the Farm300 program. If we go on to the next slide, this is just a table that we compiled just to have a look at, well, what did we achieve under the CFI? Has this been the real deal? Has it been a success or otherwise? And this is data up to the 2nd of February, which is really when, I guess, the previous government's program, the carbon pricing mechanism, and the CFI came to an end. That was when large industrial emitters had their final opportunity to pay for their pollution with the government. So at that point, at the start of February, we had about 200 carbon farming initiative projects registered. And you can see from that table that the split there across 4 general categories of forestry, landfill, livestock, which is really piggeries, and savanna burning projects, which are up in the far north. And you can see they're really, those forestry projects and landfill projects were very, very successful in issuing carbon credits. So those, the 3rd column there in our table, that's the number of carbon credits that have actually been issued and delivered to those project owners. And if you total those up, if you excluding landfill, it was about 6.85 million carbon credits issued and delivered to landholders who were running primarily avoided deforestation projects, and also further north we had the sort of improved fire management projects. So given that the carbon price under the previous government scheme was around about $20, that was nearly $140 million that went to landholders under the Carbon Farming Initiative, which I think is a pretty fantastic outcome for those landholders, particularly given that, from a standing start and over a couple of years, and when you consider all of the policy uncertainty and noise that was surrounding the scheme, it's great that those landholders got involved and took advantage of the incentives that were available to them. It's not an insignificant amount of money that has now gone to producers and landholders through their participation in the CFI. I guess looking forward though, what can we expect to see under the ERF? Well, if we go to the next slide, this graphic, this image, was produced by the Clean Energy Regulator because last week we got the results back from the first auction that was held for the Emissions Reduction Fund. There's a lot of numbers there you probably see on your screen. The resolution's not great. This is available again through the Clean Energy Regulator website, but probably the key numbers to think about. The government has offered 107 contracts to 144 different projects. That is, they've agreed to buy their carbon credits from those projects, and that's equivalent to about 47 million tonnes. So 47 million carbon credits the government's agreed to purchase, and now those carbon credits will come in and be delivered to the government over the next 10 years. And the average price paid for those carbon credits was $13.95. So a pretty good carbon price, around about $14, and a huge amount of abatement that's been already contracted by the government. So the transition from the CFI to the Emissions Reduction Fund is alive and well. The government has effectively just contracted about $660 million in carbon credits. So I think that there is a very big pie there. That's $660 million of the $2.55 billion on offer. So there's a very big pie there, and there's a lot of opportunity for landholders to get involved. So I think while there is certainly some complexity and there's absolutely some barriers to entry, and we'll talk about some of that later on, I'd say that there is an opportunity there for people to take a serious look at. If you did want to participate in the auction, if we just go to the next slide, there's a few steps you need to go through. And again, all of this is on the Clean Energy Regulator website, so I won't spend too long on this because I'm conscious of time. But really, you need to have a registered project. So you need to go through the process of identifying your project and registering it, so getting it approved by the government. Subsequent to that, you then register to participate in the auction itself. And there's a couple of steps involved in that. In particular, you need to tell them how many carbon credits you expect to deliver, over what duration, and what sort of contract you want. So you can contract a full 7 years of abatement. So you can say for the next 7 years, I'll be producing the X number of carbon credits per year for the next 7 years. You can do a contract that's less than 7 years, or you can wait until you've actually issued your carbon credits and then do what's called an immediate delivery, like a spot contract. So you'd wait until you've actually implemented your project, issued your carbon credits, and then turn up to an auction and say, righto, I can sell you this number of credits for this price. So when it comes time to participate in the auction, you actually just, because you've pre-registered and given the government all the details about your project, you simply need to put in the price at which you're prepared to sell your credits, and the government then purchases that abatement based on lowest costs. So they've got a benchmark price in mind, which they don't disclose, which is the highest price that they'll pay, and they'll buy abatement, effectively buy all the carbon credits up underneath that benchmark price. So it incentivises you to know the economics of your project and bid at a price at which you're happy to be paid, but which you think represents good value to the government. Because if you miss out on a contract, obviously you've got no one there to buy your credits at the end of the day. So going to the next slide, where are we in terms of methodology development? So if you are thinking about a project, what could you feasibly do on your property? And we'll spend the rest of the presentation looking at this. If we go back to February 2013, we really didn't have a lot of methodologies available to producers, and this is, I guess, one of the messages that I was putting out there to coaches when we were talking to those involved in Farm300 was that, it was all very well to kind of have a few opportunities, particularly around the avoided deforestation area, and if you're up north with better fire management, but we weren't yet in a position to be able to offer livestock producers something tangible that they could do yet. I think there's a very different story now. If you look at February 2015, where we've got to, there's a couple of new methodologies that have been registered, nitrate supplementation for cattle producers. We've got a soil carbon methodology that's been approved. And then if you look at those methodologies in red, we've got a handful that should be approved in the coming weeks and months. And then going into the second half of this year, we've got one in particular, the sheep flock management method, which I'll spend a bit of time on looking at the end. So I think we've got now a pipeline of methodologies that will provide, I guess, the vehicle for producers to get involved. So we've had a bit of a slow start, but we are certainly working towards getting more methodology options for producers to use. And I'll give you, I guess, in the next couple of slides, an overview of two of those methodologies. One is the whole herd management method, which is relevant for beef cattle producers, and the other one is the sheep flock management method, which is a bit further away, but I think provides some interesting opportunities. If we go to the next slide, though, before we get stuck into some detail around those methods, one of the key things that I think people need to be aware of when we're dealing with livestock methods as opposed to some of the vegetation methodologies is the need for aggregation. So outside of the, I guess, large-scale corporate farming, I guess individual producers are probably not going to have enough emissions on their farms and hence not enough emission reduction to make it worth their while to go it alone in developing an ERF project. So one of the things that we're looking at the moment, and we're in the process of doing a couple of projects to build a business case around how aggregation might work for livestock producers, and that information will come out through MLA so that people can start to get a bit of a feel for what might be involved. And look, the basics of it are you need enough emission reductions produced by your projects to justify getting involved in the scheme. Otherwise, the transaction costs involved in going through the ERF process won't make it worth your while. So I'll provide a case study later on as to how a hypothetical ERF aggregation could work and what that might look like. But keep an eye out for some of those case studies that will be coming out in the middle of the year from MLA in relation to aggregation under the ERF. So on the next slide, I've just got a couple of slides now on the details around this herd management methodology. So we're hopeful that at the next committee meeting that the government will be holding in a few days' time, we'll get a tick of approval for this methodology, which we've been working on with MLA and the team up at AACO. So really, it's quite a generic methodology that aligns really, really well with what we've been talking about under Farm300, and that is if you can, improve your whole herd efficiency and productivity, you can reduce emissions intensity. And this methodology provides you with a way of quantifying those improvements in efficiency and recognises the emissions intensity improvements that brings and allows you to create a carbon credit. And I say it's generic because really there's a whole lot of pathways, as we've already heard on the webinar, whereby you can improve emissions intensity. So there's a whole lot of mechanisms which your coaches will have been talking about that lead to productivity improvements that also result in improvement in emissions intensity. So I won't go over those again, but just know that anything you can do to improve productivity and reduce emissions intensity will be eligible under this methodology as long as it's a new management activity. Going to the next slide, the basics of the methodology require you to have some historical data. So, I know a lot of the groups involved in Farm300 have been doing benchmarking for quite a while. So hopefully having some data there for the last, at least 3 years in the last 5 on the number of animals in your herd and the live weights that you've sold for slaughter gives you the basics to determine your sort of historical emissions intensity. That is your tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions per tonne of live weight sold. And that, baseline emissions intensity metric becomes really important because that's the way in which we compare your old production system to the new and improved and more productive system that you're implementing under your project. So then, once you've got that historical emissions intensity metric, we look to implement the project, and as I've mentioned before, you'll get 7 years of carbon credits if you decide to go ahead. Again, any new management action that improves herd efficiency to reduce emissions will be eligible. The key thing during your project, again, is record keeping. So you've got to know your animal numbers and live weights. If you've been providing supplementary feed, you've got to provide a bit of information about that. And again, you've got to know the live weight that you've sold for slaughter and or live export. So I won't spend too much more time on the detail of that methodology other than to say we're hopeful that in the coming weeks it will be approved and there will be a method there for the beef cattle producers to have a look at and think about whether it's worth getting involved. So I'm just conscious of the time. I'll finish off now if we go to the next slide with a case study. So I worked with, did a bit of work during the Farm300 program with a couple of coaches down in Victoria, John Marriott and James Whale, and they've provided me with a little bit of data based on the work that they did with their groups going through the Farm300 program, where they looked at their current enterprises and they used some of that historical data that they had and then built some forecasts and built themselves some targets for each producer to sort of say, well, look, where are we now and where do we want to get to and what are the management actions that we want to implement to improve the productivity of our farm? And then John and James have put that data and the forecast changes to those producers' enterprises and map them into some of the greenhouse gas calculators, so that they can then track, well, what's the impact on our productivity, but also what are the resulting improvements in emissions that we can see. So under this case study, I've taken some data from 8 of those, so 7 of those prime lamb producers, and I've just applied here this hypothetical improved flock management ERF methodology that we hope will be approved by the end of the year. So this is all hypothetical, but just gives us a sense of how these methodologies might work and how they might align with the story around productivity and emissions intensity that we've been hearing about under Farm300. So the coaches talked about a range of new management strategies, and really you could think about anything that you've done in your coaching programs that aligns with this. And then if we go to the next slide, what I've done is pull together the data from these 7 prime lamb producers and said, well, right, for 3 preceding years, what have been their emissions on farms, and these are aggregated up, and what's been the live weight produced. And then you can see, the averages across the 3 years for both the emissions and live weight produced. And then what that allows us to do is get this metric for your average emissions intensity, which is this 17.67. So it's 17.67 tonnes of emissions per tonne of live weight produced. So that's our baseline, or our business as usual emissions performance. If you go to the next slide, what we did then was to say, well, if we forecast improvements and changes in enterprise structure and new management approaches for the next 3 years, what happens? I guess the key things to look at there are, obviously we've got a significant uplift in the amount of live weight produced, so we've got nearly a 90% increase in live weight. I know that's quite significant, and that's really been driven by a couple of the producers really changing their enterprise mix and getting a lot heavier into prime lamb production and out of beef and wool. So don't be put off by that huge live weight increase. Really interestingly though, because of the efficiencies that we were forecasting and that John and James have been working with their producers, we're hoping to get over a 35% reduction in emissions intensity. Now the key metrics to look at here is what are the emissions under this kind of project forecast, that top little table there, and then what's the live weight that's associated with. And under these methodologies, what we can do is we can say, well, and if we go to the next slide, we can say, well, if we produce that same amount of live weight, but under our old, emissions intensity level, what would our baseline or business as usual emissions have been? So we take our forecast live weight, our forecast sort of production levels, but multiply that by our old sort of inefficient emissions intensity level. And that's what gives us these baseline emissions numbers in this table. Then we compare that to our actual emissions, which we've achieved because we're running a more productive, more efficient system, and that's what gives us our emission reductions. So we're really using that old emissions intensity metric and scaling that to the level of production that we're achieving under our improved project scenario to give us our emission reduction amounts. If we go to the next slide, what I did then was to roll that out over 7 years, basically just repeated that table for 7 years to just do a bit of a guesstimate really of what emission reductions we might be able to achieve. And we can see there over the 7 years, our baseline emissions would have been about 40,000 tonnes. Our project emissions would have been about 25,000 tonnes. And so across those 7 prime land producers, they've generated 15,500 carbon credits over their 7-year crediting period. And if we multiply that by our carbon price that was paid at this first ERF auction of $13.95, we're getting over $200,000 in revenue. Now, as I mentioned, there's certainly some costs involved in participating in the scheme. I've made some very, very, very simple assumptions around those costs and what they might be. And you can see there I've just assumed a bit of cost in there for monitoring and record keeping, and some cost in there to pay the auditors who would come in and have a look at those 7 farms. And I've guessed and projected that based on those very rough sort of back of the envelope calculations, there'd be about $140,000 there spread across those 7 farms. So, it's not a gold mine, but certainly there's additional reward for improvements in productivity through participating in the ERF. And certainly if you can spread those transaction costs across a group of producers, there might be some opportunities in the future to participate as these new methods come online for both beef herd management and later on in the year, we hope, improved flock management. So just the final slide now, just to wrap up. I guess the key message I want to say is that the emissions reduction fund auctions have started. The government's already, contracted $660 million of carbon credits. We've got new and more relevant methodologies that are coming online for livestock producers. Aggregation is going to be key, particularly in the south where you've got individually small producers, because you need that scale to overcome transaction costs. And also, as we've seen through the Farm300 program, that kind of group work allows also the sharing of expertise. And as I said, look, the dollar value isn't huge, but it does add to the income that you're going to get from improving your livestock productivity across your enterprises. And keeping records of everything is critical, because if you want to claim a carbon credit, you have to be able to prove what you've done. So I'll finish up there, and hope that's been helpful for people. Cheers.
Thanks, Phil. While we've got you there's a couple of questions here for you. The first one is whether, in your opinion, you think in the auction system that different activities may be valued differently, and as an example, mitigation versus sequestration?
From the government's perspective, they're not creating any kind of segments around different project activities, and they're not kind of attributing any different values or to those different activities. They are buying purely on price. They're going for, value for money is their approach. Now, having said that, different types of project activities will have different price points at which they can deliver abatement. And I guess that's the competitive nature of these auctions, is that, you'll have, those waste management projects going up against avoided deforestation, going up against savanna burning, and then down the track, as we get not only more methodologies that are relevant for agriculture, but also methodologies that are relevant, say, for energy efficiency projects, you'll see some of those perhaps industrial emitters coming in and participating in auctions after they've done, say, fuel switching or energy efficiency projects. So each of those project types, and going down to individual farms or individual production, industrial emitters, will have different price points for their carbon credits. Okay, and a second one, if the ERF purchased 47 megatons at $13.95 and the government's target is 236 million tonnes, that is 188 million tonnes remaining, does that mean the future price will be below $10 a tonne to stay within the ERF budget? That's a good question. I think based on these first numbers, basically they've spent 25% of their budget to buy 15% of the abatement that they need. So there's one of two things that could happen. I think one is, maybe they will need to lower their prices in order to buy more abatement. And the second thing is that people need to remember is that the ERF is not the sole mechanism by which we'll meet our national target. That is that 236 million tonnes that we're estimating we're going to need to reduce in order to hit our national target. So we've got the renewable energy target, as long as that can get kick-started again once this policy impasse has been overcome. There's everything from vehicle emission standards, appliance efficiency standard, anything can contribute to our national target. Obviously the ERF is going to be a big driver of that, but it's not the only game in town in terms of meeting a national target. So yes, if it was the only mechanism that we could use to reach our national target, we've probably spent more than we can afford to. But I think people need to bear in mind that this will be one of a range of policy mechanisms by which the government's hoping that we'll be able to hit that target. Okay, thanks, Phil. There's quite a few other questions. What we'll try to do is provide those on the web, answers to those, because we've got to finish up now. So just want to hand back to Jane and just get Jane to outline the next steps, where to from here.
Okay, well, the coaching program is due to finish around the end of May, but between now and then we'd hope to work with the coaches and also the existing groups to see whether or not they're interested in continuing on, and then look at what funding models might underpin that for them to continue on, largely because, you know, they've really just started to hit their straps in implementing some really interesting new practices. So we'll work with the existing groups. We'll also look to broaden out the number of groups that we have if we set up a sustainable funding model going forward in that process. But I guess just in terms of the baseline tools, just everyone can find those at the MLA website. They'll be maintained on the Farm300 page, where you'll find all the resources, the videos and fact sheets that can be used by anyone. There's also the contact details of the 23 trained coaches. So if there's a particular group that's interested in having a look at starting up a group with the existing coaches, then it's a good opportunity to contact them to discuss what opportunities there might be there. And I guess we'll also look at continue to developing some of the decision support material that is available to producers. So yeah, it's been a really successful program. The evaluation that's coming through is pretty impressive in terms of what's been achieved to date with the producer groups overall, and yeah, hopefully we will be able to continue that into the future.
Thanks, Jane. So just to finish up, I'd really like to thank James and John for their time today. Also, I'd like to thank Leanne Sheriff and Irene Sabota, who do a lot of work administering the project, in fact probably most of the work, and I'd also like to thank the participants today, and we will do our best to get those answers back to your questions. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much.